So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am so pleased and honored to welcome you to today's program, Fighting Hate in Billings, Montana. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice like this one, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. The events in Billings were partially inspired by the apocryphal story that King Christian X of Denmark wore a yellow star in support of Danish Jews during the German occupation of the country. Although this did not really happen, Courage to Act tells the story of how Jewish and non-Jewish neighbors of all ages in the country mobilized to create one of the most effective and exceptional examples of mass resistance and escape in modern history. Despite enormous risk, ordinary citizens united against Nazism to save nearly 95% of Denmark's Jewish population. You can learn more about this exhibition and get tickets on the museum's website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Margaret MacDonald, Chuck Tooley, Darrell Ehrlick, and Dr. Janice Cohn. Margaret is an American activist who served as a member of the Montana Senate for the 26th District from 2017 to 2021. She previously served 4 terms in the Montana House of Representatives, representing the 54th and 51st District. She also served as Democratic Minority Whip in both chambers of the legislature. For 14 years, she was director of the Montana Association of Churches, among other actions, organizing the Not in Our Town campaign against racism and white supremacy. She is currently the interim executive director of Big Sky 55 Plus, which aims to inform Montanans about how their elected officials address policies of vital interest and importance. Chuck was a city leader during the events of 1993 and introduced the city's anti-hate resolution, which remains the only resolution in the city archives signed by all city council members. As mayor, Chuck appointed a Human Relations Commission for the purpose of promoting mutual understanding and respect for all. He retired undefeated as the longest-serving mayor of Billings and was later appointed a Human Rights Commissioner for the state of Montana. Chuck is a U.S. Army veteran of the Cold War in Europe and the Ground War in Vietnam. He's been president of Tooley Communications since he founded the company in 1984 and has served as a director on the boards of local, national, and international nonprofit organizations. He speaks frequently on citizenship and leadership. Darrell is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Montanan after leading his native state's largest newspaper, the Billings Gazette. He is an award-winning journalist, author, historian, and teacher whose career has taken him to North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Utah, and Wyoming. As the head of the Billings Gazette, Darrell chose to republish the menorahs in the paper on the anniversary of the Not in Our Town movement. He is also the author of the nonfiction book, It Happened in Minnesota. Janice is a psychotherapist who specializes in helping adults and children cope with grief, loss, and life transitions, and the author of several highly acclaimed books. Her books have been cited for excellence by various educational organizations and have received critical praise from publications such as the New York Times Book Review, School Library Journal, and Publishers Weekly, among others. A former newspaper columnist and special consultant to the New Jersey family court system, she learned of the 1993 events in Billings by reading about it in the New York Times. She then traveled to Montana to interview members of the community and research what happened, which led to her creation of the beloved book, The Christmas Menorahs, which was recently reissued in a 30th anniversary edition with expanded content. And you can find out more at thechristmasmenorahs.com, which is also posted in the chat. So I want to thank all of you who are joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things off to Janice.
Hello. So at the very end of the museum's wonderful exhibit about the 1943 rescue of the Danish Jews, there is a quote from a rescuer: "We were not heroes," which is a very typical quote from rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. But I've actually been thinking about that phrase a lot, because when I visited Billings after the extraordinary events of the town's 1993 holiday season, which our panelists will get into, and which was in turn inspired in part by the events in Denmark 50 years earlier, the sentiment of the citizens of Billings was pretty much the same. We were not heroes. In the end, history will be the judge about both those moments in time, but there are striking similarities. For most of 1993, Billings was fighting not the Nazis, but white supremacists. Then, as Christmas and Hanukkah approached, the tiny Jewish community became the target of particular venom. As acts of hate escalated, young Isaac Schnitzer's bedroom window, which displayed a Hanukkah menorah, was smashed with a cinder block that landed on Isaac's bed. The town was then galvanized into action. There were many unsung heroes in Billings during that time, but 6 remarkable people whose backgrounds led them to that moment stand out. First, Wayne Inman, who was Billings' chief of police in 1993. He had been the assistant chief of police in Portland, Oregon, when a group of white supremacists came to town and announced they were going to kill Blacks, or quote, mud people, as they call them. Wayne urged town citizens to take actions, but people resisted, thinking it was best to ignore the group and not give them any more oxygen. Until one night, an Ethiopian exchange student was walking home from the university when he was surrounded by the supremacists and beaten to death for no other reason than the color of his skin. Then there were marches and protests, but it was too late. A man had been killed, and Wayne had been unable to prevent it. So when Wayne was offered a job in his home state of Montana, he jumped at the chance, because after all, there had been no white supremacists in Billings until there was. And Wayne passionately resolved that this time, under his watch, the town would take action. Another person is Tammy Schnitzer, who was Isaac Schnitzer's mom. She had been raised a Christian in Billings until she converted to Judaism after marrying Brian Schnitzer. Never having experienced bigotry as a Christian, she was unprepared to experience it as a Jew. She refused to accept this and forcefully spoke out. Margaret MacDonald, who is, of course, with us today, was the director of the Montana Association of Churches in 1993. She was angered by the well-meaning advice given to the Schnitzers and other Jewish families to remove their menorahs and Hanukkah decorations because it was too dangerous to display them. Advice which the Jewish families rejected, asking how people would feel if they were asked to take down their Christmas trees and Christmas decorations because it was too dangerous to let people know that they were Christian. Margie searched for a way for Billings to show solidarity with the Jewish community. And then, from the deep recesses of her mind, she remembered a story she had been told as a child. Reverend Keith Torney, Margie's minister, believed in the Native American concept of Andinuk, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means the benevolent desires of the soul, and the importance of people being able to find ways to express that goodness. He was certain that the citizens of Billings now had a chance to do that. Chuck Tooley had long been active in fighting hatred and bigotry. And Chuck, of course, is also with us today. He was an elected official of Billings, soon to become the town's mayor, and believed in the importance of government's role to confront the scourge of hatred and bigotry. Lastly, there was Sarah Anthony, who was an outspoken member of the Billings Human Rights Coalition, and as determined as her ancestor, Susan B. Anthony, to fight for human rights. There was also the town newspaper, the Billings Gazette, which had been continuously in print since 1885, which was 4 years before Montana had actually achieved statehood, and which felt compelled in 1993 to take a principled stand. Darrell Ehrlick was the editor, who's with us today, was the editor of the Gazette from 2012 to 2020. His association with the paper actually began when he was a paper boy for the Gazette at age 12. Before that, his great-grandparents, who had immigrated from Russia, had learned to speak English by faithfully reading copies of the Gazette. I love that story. He gives a fascinating look at how the now iconic Billings Gazette, which will be, I believe, displayed on the screen, how that appeal to the community came to be. These personalities and the Gazette itself converged to meet the moment in the way that they did. Chuck, can you talk to us about the events leading up to the smashing of Isaac Schnitzer's bedroom window?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Janice. Thanks for asking. Even though many people know about the Christmas Menorahs, which is also the title of Janice's wonderful book, they're not aware that events started happening months and months earlier, actually back in January of 1993. I can remember the night of the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, when a wonderful set of activities took place. People gathered, hundreds of people, organized by the Montana Association of Churches. Thank you, Margaret MacDonald, former executive director, to commemorate Dr. King by marching on a cold winter night with the clergy in their long robes carrying tall torches from the American Lutheran Church to the Episcopal Church to St. Patrick's Co-Cathedral to the United Methodist Church, wherever there's a wonderful ceremony. When we came back to our cars, we noticed that there were flyers under the windshield wipers, and we removed them and read hateful words about Jews, about African Americans, about homosexuals, about our police chief even, Wayne Inman. Well, what I learned, although Margie and others had known this in the past, what I learned is that right-wing organizations, skinheads, Ku Klux Klans, and others had targeted the Northwest United States as an ideal homeland for the white race. And this is part of their activity. The flyers that we picked up had a disclosure at the bottom printed by the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, this incident is one of many, but it really is the marker in my mind about the beginning of what the people of Billings rose up to do. Led by Margie MacDonald, the clergy in the Billings area organized a march called Stand Together Billings. Hundreds of Billings citizens marched down Poly Drive, ended up on campus at Rocky Mountain College. That kind of set a precedent, and every year since we've had a festival of cultures on that same green, celebrating the variety and diversity in our community, with singing and dancing and ethnic foods, and it's a wonderful celebration. There were so many incidents, but let me just tick off a few. One morning, a Native American single mother woke up to find her house spray painted with epithets and a swastika. She notified somebody, the Billings Human Rights Coalition. Margie already mentioned Janice, you mentioned Sarah Anthony, organized about 18 or 20 Billings Painters Union members to come and scrape and repaint that woman's house free of charge. Let's see, what else? Oh, the Wayman Chapel, my goodness, a small, mostly elderly, mostly African-American congregation on the south side of Billings went to church one morning and saw that there were two skinheads standing with their arms folded in the back of the sanctuary, just glaring. The pastor said, "Come on in and sit down and join us." And they just stood there and glared. Well, when other people found out about this, I don't know if it was you, Margie, but certainly some of the people from First Congregational Church downtown started coming on a regular basis, and members of other churches as well, to sit in the congregation on Sunday mornings, so to relieve the anxiety of those older folks. To my knowledge, the skinheads did not come back, but when a bomb threat was made later in the year at Beth Aaron Synagogue, oh gosh, it must have been 100 and 150 of us gathered at a safe distance away and supported our Jewish neighbors with singing, with conversation, and just with pure love. Just trying to think of what else. Dr. Uri Barnea, the conductor, the director of our symphony, had his front door smashed in, the storm door smashed in with a beer bottle because he is a Jew. The Jewish cemetery in Billings had its gravestones knocked over and broken. Crosses were burned on the front lawns of both Catholic and Protestant citizens. I introduced as a member of Billings City Council. I was the mayor pro tem at the time, and the mayor actually asked me to introduce the resolution, which I can talk about later, but we got a unanimous vote against hate, against racism in our community, and that joined the efforts of dozens, if not hundreds, of other community organizations that had actually signed up and put their names on the line. Thousands of citizens signed an ad that was published in the Billings Gazette against hate activity, against discrimination and racism. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that were happening all that year until we get to December of 1993.
Thank you very much, Chuck.
Sure.
Margie, I'm going to ask you, what made you think about that story, which I'm going to let you tell, which what it was. How did you access that? What made you think about it, and what made you think that you could use that as a tool to inspire your community?
You know, at the time, it was very spontaneous, as you and Chuck Tooley have already explained. We as a community had been working, I think, pretty diligently for months prior to the cinder block going through Isaac's window to try and elevate and help people understand how important it is that when a group when someone tries to isolate and target and bully and intimidate and victimize a small minority within a larger community, that it is really critical and incumbent on that wider community to take it personally and to own it, and to not say, oh gosh, those, that's really too bad about Congregation Beth Aaron, but rather say, we are all Congregation Beth Aaron at that time. So we were trying to find ways for people to be walking in each other's shoes and to connect. But I picked up the newspaper. I think it was a Thursday evening when Isaac's home was vandalized. And the very next day, his parents, I think, made a very courageous decision, kind of in spite of the law enforcement saying, more or less, take down the decorations, don't draw attention if you want to be safe. Instead, Tammy and Brian held a press conference, and they talked to the Billings Gazette, which covered it on their front page with a big picture of the window and of the parents. And in the story, Tammy is quoted as saying, or maybe Brian, that that the police officer who investigated had said, well, maybe you should take the decorations down. And I too at that time had I think a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. I had very young children, and you know how hard that would be as a family to try and strip your home of all the symbols of the season. So for that just hit me in the gut, really. And it popped into my head that maybe we could do something that would make it safer for families that had been targeted by encouraging the wider community to put menorahs in their windows. So then it wouldn't be this very, very small Jewish community and their families, but it would be all kinds of homes with menorahs and decorations for Hanukkah, but we specifically zeroed in on the menorahs. And by the time that story was published on a Saturday morning, we were in, you know, kind of full-fledged Advent season, and there was a big rehearsal down at our church planned for the Christmas pageant, which at church, which would have been the very following day on Sunday. So I called our pastor, who had been very supportive of all the work we had done, but I still felt it was maybe, you know, pushing him to say, what would you think about handing out making copies and handing out menorahs and giving them to these families to encourage them to put them in their windows, so that the Schnitzer family, the Barnea family, these homes that have decorations aren't such an obvious target, and the community is saying, hey, we're not buying into your ideas here, folks. That was always what we were trying to get across. And so he gets down to the church. He said yes, he would do it. He goes down to church, and there on the copy machine, Sydney is sharing with you what turned out to be the curriculum of our Sunday school for that Sunday, which was that Hanukkah menorah that you can see. For the younger grades, they were going to take it home and color it and cut it out. And then each day of Hanukkah, they would put a little flame up. And just by coincidence, that was we already had 100 copies made, because that was supposed to be our curriculum for the day. The rest is kind of history. We reached out to a bunch of other churches, and they got right on it. And people really embraced and leaned into that. And it went beyond the churches, lots of businesses. There was a kind of a 7-Eleven type chain of stores that put them on their counters. And there were dry cleaners that put them, made thousands of copies and had them on the counter. And so people really, really took that to heart. But
Margie,
the story that Janice had tried to get me to reference was the Danish story is what inspired me, which was, rather than let this small group kind of be singled out by having everybody wear the stars, or that's my understanding. I understand now it's apocryphal, but that was a way to counter those ideas. And so very much the inspiration was the Danish story, and I just think it's powerful, and I'm glad to see this story as being carried forward to a new generation. Thank you, Janice, for your incredible work on this, and to the museum for lifting this up and continuing to tell these stories. I think that's how we all learn, how children learn who we are as a people and what it means to be a community.
It does show the power of stories, doesn't it? Even apocryphal stories. I think the legend of King Christian is, you know, really caught people's imagination. I remember hearing it as a child, and had no idea that it was a legend at that point. But I remember it stuck with me, and that was one of the reasons actually that I wanted to come to Billings, because the actions that were taken were inspired by the legend of King Christian. Margie, can you talk about how the community responded to your idea and the church's idea of putting up pictures of menorahs? Because there was danger, there was potential danger, wasn't there?
One thing that was really striking to me, and over the years since then, I have heard many, many stories about the deliberation and the kind of the moral discussions really that occurred around kitchen tables at that time as people came to a collective decision in their family or their household on to put this picture of a menorah up, knowing that it could be followed by somebody doing something, you know, very scary and dangerous. So one of the stories I learned several years after that was a Catholic community of sisters, the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, who had a home in West Billings, and several of their members of that community were elderly. And they were having that discussion as a community. Should we do this? Should we put this menorah in our window? And as it was told to me a few years later, the oldest and most infirm of that community said, you know, I will probably have a little trouble going to sleep at night if we do this. And she took a breath and then she said, but I won't sleep at all if we don't. And that clinched it. And they did. And, you know, there were just, I have heard so many stories of that whole process of the decision making. Another dear friend who had a 12-year-old at the time, she and her husband decided to do this. They had a family of 4 children. And their 12-year-old, their oldest, was, gosh, you know, why are we doing this? Isn't this dangerous? You know, and was a little, you know, kind of freaked out about it. And she and her husband said, no, you know, this is who we are. This is important. This is why it's important. We will be taking a little risk, but that's so that we reduce, the whole community becomes safer. And the more people who do it, the safer we are. And they were able to convey that, I think, to another generation of kids. And I think that was one of the most significant and important things about this.
I think that's Billings' greatest legacy, what they left for their kids, many of whom I know had those kinds of discussions with their families, and we'll never forget that. Margie, can you talk about some of the things that happened that were intimidating for families? For instance, before the nuns made the decision that they made, I believe the Catholic high school that had displayed a picture of a menorah had a bullet shot through it. Weren't there also phone calls and other threats that families had?
Yes, there was a round of reprisals for people who had took the extraordinary step, and so there were I think there was a rock through the window of Darrell's church, and I know there was a gunshot at Billings Central Catholic High School, and then individual homes in various neighborhoods had some signs of vandalism and responses, and the law enforcement took the position then, a unified front of our police chief, who you already mentioned, the sheriff, the county attorney, held a press conference along with a Lutheran pastor who was very prophetic and had traveled in Germany not long after the Second World War to give witness to what had happened there. And they all basically called on the community to hold strong, to stand firm. And that's that point when I think the Gazette put the menorah in, and it was even more, thousands more went up, and that solidarity at that juncture was really critical.
So, Darrell, that brings us to you. Can you tell us how that iconic appeal to the community, how that came to be.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you, Janice. Thank you, friends, for tuning in and uh, for paying attention to this. What I think is still a probably very relevant lesson today. I was not the Billings Gazette editor in 1993. I was a high school senior, and Margie just referenced the window, the rock in the window of First United Methodist Church, and that window was my mother's. She had put up a menorah, as had our whole church, and hers was the window. So I have a dual experience of both being a part of it and feeling, being a very young man. I was 18 at the time, and then from a journalist perspective. But one of the things there's two things that I want to emphasize about newspapers is at one time, especially like the Billings Gazette was the largest newspaper in the state. And that's lucky because at one time, those larger newspapers tended to hold on to reporters and editors. So there was more of an institutional memory. And so even when I arrived at the Billings Gazette in 2012, there were still people who were present when that happened. And it was always something that the paper regarded, and still does, and rightfully so, with a lot of pride. And the other thing that I would like to say is newspapers have a really kind of unique position in American media landscape because of their tradition of the opinion page and the editorial page. And we could do a lot of talk about that. That's both a blessing and a curse for newspaper editors. But one of the things that those pages had done, and the Billings Gazette had a daily editorial for more than a century by that point. And one of the things that you do in editorials is usually say something like, "We need to pay attention," or "This needs action." But in the midst of this very serious, there were crosses, there were flyers, there were bricks, there was threats. It's a very powerless, I can tell you, having been an editor now for more than 20 years, it's a very frustrating position because you realize that as a newspaper or as a member of the media, you do have a powerful voice and a role, but you can't necessarily stop. You can report, you can describe, but the paper decided, and there were two people that if in the Gazette lore, whose names will pop up with this story. One of them was the publisher, Wayne Sheely, who had his detractors and his supporters, kind of a controversial figure in his own right, and David Crisp, a journalist who's still working. And everybody was trying to figure out what to do because the newspaper, as a community institution, not only did the Gazette predate the state of Montana, it predated the charter of Billings, the actual city itself. So this is a very powerful, long-time community institution, and it wanted to do something, but what? And so it, I think, took the lead of the churches. And in our church, one of the funny stories that I still think is hilarious, I was around when we were trying to figure out, we were First United Methodist Church, how to do a Hanukkah. I don't think we had the same Sunday school, or not Hanukkah, how to do a menorah. We didn't have the same Sunday school lessons. So we went to one of those giant clip art books, if you remember, and searched through and found like a blocky line drawing of a menorah. And then we took it to a photocopier and we blew it up, and then we blew that up, and it was a postage stamp size originally. And so when we put up the menorahs, they were, kind of grainy because we'd taken something postage stamp and put it on an entire paper. But that's what we did. And then we printed it off in colored paper so they could see. And that's what was blown out. So the Gazette, having more graphic artists and designers at the time, decided that the way we do this is we can print it. And at the time too, mechanically speaking, it was an effort to put something that could be a full, not just one page, but what we call the middle fold or the center section, so that it would be even larger. And that was hard for two reasons, because A, that was prime real estate. Advertisers love that. And also it was hard because when publishing something like that took a different layout and a setup, because it's, as you can tell, it's not necessarily, that's not how you read, it's upside down. And then so that was a real effort as well. So this was something, and it was a stroke of genius, because these went up all around town too, and we overran the press. That means that we printed additional copies. The other thing, that even by the time I arrived, and I was born and raised here, I'm fourth generation from Yellowstone County, even by the time I arrived here in 2012 as the editor, people would still come in and say, do you have some of those? Can I buy a copy of that? And that delighted me. And that led to us republishing it on the 20th anniversary with the Not in Our Town movement. Both Chuck and Margie were involved in that. And when we did that, that was my choice. And one of the things that I wanted to do is make sure that the community kept the memory alive, and kept this what I consider a real high point in the town's history alive, and remembering that. And then the second thing that we did, though, is everybody wanted it reprinted just the same. And the problem with that is newspapers often, every day we print a new edition of a paper and we basically jettison the old, right? So we had to dig. We sent a graphic designer back, and thankfully someone had the wisdom of saving really important logos and commonly used things in old CD-ROMs. We just had stacks of them. So by going through those, they actually found the original menorahs, and we were able to reprint them on the 20th anniversary of the Not in Our Town movement, which is what it became.
Darrell, can you tell the story of your friend from Slovakia?
Sure.
How someone from Slovakia found out about what happened in Billings, Montana, and his reaction to that.
Yeah. So I have a good friend who has a lot of connections to Czechoslovakia, Slovakia now, the Czech Republic. And he was and his name is Pavel Demiš. He's an NGO coordinator throughout Europe, but he had also been the one of the ministers under the Václav Havel in the Velvet Revolution, when communism was peacefully dumped in. And Pavel was visiting Billings, and he came by the office, and this was 3 years. I think this was around 2016 or 17. And when we reprinted the menorahs, I put mine up in my office window, which faces 4th Avenue in Billings, a kind of a thoroughfare. And you know what happens to newsprint in cars if you leave it out. Well, mine had been exposed to sunlight for 3 or 4 years, so it could almost, if you touched it, it would almost turn into dust. But I had it up there, and he said, "What is that?" And he said, "That's one of those menorahs I know about, Not in Our Town. I know what that is." And I said, I was blown away, because I didn't know that he knew that. And so we did an impromptu where Margie's church is, and where the First United Methodist Church, of which I'm a member, is all really within about a 2-block radius of the Gazette. So we, in the spur of the moment, went on an impromptu tour of these places so that he could see, because he knew the whole story. I had to tell him nothing. And then at the end, I took a X-Acto knife and very carefully cut the tape, and we actually folded it up and put it in between cardboard, and it's now in his office in Slovakia.
That's marvelous.
So yeah, so it lives on.
Forgive me, because we want to get to Chuck Tooley and our time is running out. Chuck, you had accepted on behalf of the town of Billings the Raoul Wallenberg Award for the town. Can you please just talk about that, the significance of that, what it meant, and why they chose Billings?
Oh, Chuck, you are muted.
I'd be happy to, Janice. In 1997, the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of the United States, the chairman of the board called me and asked if we would be willing to accept an award for civic courage from their organization. And I thanked them for contacting me and told them I'd get back to them, and then started researching what the Raoul Wallenberg Committee was. And they were organized to honor the life and the character and the courage of a Swedish diplomat named Raoul Wallenberg, who was an architect and a businessman. He attended the University of Michigan and was familiar with many Americans, but he made his living primarily from between Sweden and Central Europe doing trading. Well, he was actually recruited by someone who represented the, oh gosh, what is it? It's the, it was the War Refugee Board. And he was recruited to help save Hungarians who were being persecuted by the Nazis. They'd sent about 440,000 Jews off to the camps out of Hungary. And they wanted to see if they could stop that, if they could save some of them. And so this was kind of a clandestine operation, because the Americans had something that they wanted the Swedes to do, and the Swedes had something the Americans wanted to do. So the Swedish government made Raoul Wallenberg, who didn't really have diplomatic experience, the first secretary of the Swedish legation in Budapest. And he started writing certificates of, what do they call them? Certificates of protection for Jews in Budapest, so that they could have free passage to some of these safe places around the city, including soup kitchens, hospitals, safe houses, and so forth. And he was able to save several thousand Jewish lives. And by the end of the war, instead of achieving the Nazis' goal of eliminating all Jews from Budapest, there was still about 200,000 left over. So because of his efforts, the day was saved, at least for some of the Jews in Budapest. Well, he was actually only operating for about 6 months, because he was arrested by the Soviets when they had surrounded Budapest, and they took him off. Years and years later, they said that he had died in prison, in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow in 1947, which would have put him at only 35 years old. So he accomplished all this at a very young age. Well, because of his remarkable courage, the Raoul Wallenberg Committee decided that they wanted to honor others that would demonstrate courage also. I'm trying to think, at the awards was a previous awardee, Bob Strauss, who's former chairman of the National Democratic Committee, and also ambassador to the Russian Federation under his old Texas friend, George Bush. So here's an example of a Republican president appointing a Democratic operative to ambassador to one of the most important diplomatic posts that we have, ambassador to Russia. And it was Bob Strauss who tried to find, he embarked on a very significant effort to try to find what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. They were not able to come to any definitive answer, but anyway, he tried, and he was given the award for that. Also,
excuse me, Chuck, I'd just like to interject for a moment. Can you focus on how they chose Billings? What was it about what Billings had done that made Billings the recipient of this very prestigious award?
Right. Thank you, Janice. It's because the people of Billings stood up for their Jewish neighbors at risk to themselves, and time and again they would experience violence, and they would not back down. So gosh, there were thousands and thousands of these colored menorahs hanging in windows, the menorahs that the Billings Gazette published. And there was, I think there were maybe half a dozen cars out at the Yellowstone Country Club in front of houses that had menorahs in their windows, and their windows were smashed in overnight. There's one citizen of Billings, he had about $3,000 worth of Christmas decorations on the front lawn. They were destroyed. But you know, those menorahs stayed up. When the first United Methodist Church downtown had a rock thrown through the window, or I can't remember which, right where the menorah was, they put another menorah up the next day. They just wouldn't back down. And so it was this civic courage that caused the Raoul Wallenberg Committee of the United States to give us this award.
Yeah, I have a question to ask before we wrap up, Chuck. My understanding is, for all of you, actually it's a question for all of you, that they were in 1993, there were approximately 80,000 residents of Billings. Out of those 80,000 residents, I believe there were approximately 50 Jewish families. So many people in Billings would never have had a chance to have even met a Jew, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because I think it shows even more how extraordinary the reaction was. They were not taking action on behalf of their next door neighbors. They were taking actions for many of them for families, people they never met.
Yes, it's all out of a sense of justice and fairness and kindness.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it wasn't because they were next door neighbors, although, you know, there are many prominent Jewish people in Billings. There were physicians and business people and lawyers and so forth. So people knew them, but they weren't necessarily their next door neighbor.
Yeah.
They just had a sense of justice that needed to be upheld.
Margie?
I would just add a footnote, to that thought, which is, I think the 50 to 60 families is more or less maybe the membership of Congregation Beth Aaron. I think there are many dozens more Jewish people and living in the community then and now, but that it still is an indicator of the fact that this was a very small minority within a larger community.
Okay, Sydney, shall we take questions?
Yes, and I just want to thank all four of you for being here with us and for sharing this really important story and sharing your knowledge with us before we move into questions. So the question that we've gotten a bit in a few different ways is were any of the perpetrators of any of the vandalism or violence, were they ever caught and prosecuted? Like what happened to any of those people? Yeah.
No, it was not possible. I mean, they were not, the particular incident was not, they didn't have the evidence, and I think there were lots of ideas. We did have some ideas of kind of maybe out of a half dozen people who were known to be putting out flyers and proselytizing, if you will, for the anti-Semitic kind of campaigns. We kind of suspect there were suspects, but there wasn't evidence to prosecute it. However, there was a lawsuit that was filed. It did not go very far against a couple of people who had been publishing some of the ideologies and posters, but it too did not get very far. I did see the question about the Portland and the death of Mulugeta Sarah. I don't know that I don't know that people were successfully prosecuted in that, but I do know the Southern Poverty Law Center won a very significant settlement lawsuit against us in civil courts against the White Aryan Resistance, which was a skinhead organization from I think the Bay Area that had come up to Portland and had clearly been involved in that incident. And so that there were some civil, it was a very famous case, and there's a very good book written by Morris Dees, I believe, from Southern Poverty Law Center about that incident.
Mhm. And Janice, you looked like you had something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that actually, the white supremacists literally, and all of you correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that because of the response of the town
Mhm.
and the message they were sending, they would never, ever put up with this, that they left. They just left town. Is that what happened? I believe that after that holiday season of 1993, when all of this occurred, that there were no more incidents, at least for a while. Is that accurate?
Mhm.
I think the people are still around Montana or Wyoming, and there are various names that pop up that we know were associated with it, but their campaign died on the vine at that point.
You know, one of the reasons we republished the menorah in 2013. I mean, newspapers love round numbers, 10, 25, 50, or those nice but honestly, I think it was an event that affected me personally, but I worry, and I worry now more than I actually did in 2013, that Billings or Montana would think, oh, we solved that problem. We're the hometown of not in our, we're the home birthplace of not in our town. And so we've got that taken care of. And I think we see evidence to the contrary. And it scares me because while this is I think a lot of Billings residents would know what you're talking about when you say not in our town or talk about menorahs. But I think Margie is absolutely right. There are still, we know kind of who some of the people may have been. We know the organizations. We know that the organizations may have changed the name, but the messaging is still the same.
And that actually kind of great segue. Thank you so much, Darrell, for providing me.
Happy to do it.
So Janice, I know when we've kind of talked previously that, your book, The Christmas Menorahs, is for children and that you have spoken to various school groups. But I'm wondering in Billings, how widespread is the knowledge of this now, especially amongst, younger children, and is this taught in schools? How's it looking?
Well, I can't speak Margie and Darrell and Chuck can speak about how things are now in schools. I can say when I went to Billings in early 1994, and Tammy Schnitzer had made it possible for me to go to Isaac Schnitzer's elementary school. And I spoke to many, many children there, and I spoke in groups, I spoke individually. There wasn't one single child that wasn't familiar with the story, that didn't know what happened, and who they would tell me stories of how their families had discussed whether they should put up a menorah. These were children that saw their parents, their ministers, their teachers take a stand. And I don't think that they would ever forget that. In terms of what's happening now in Billings, I'm going to throw it out to the panel because I honestly don't know.
One thought I have about that, because I was talking this morning and going on a walk with a neighbor who was a teacher, and she talked about how she taught second grade, and she would every year during December, she would read the Christmas Menorahs to her students. And she wondered out loud if the world we live in has become so polarized and fractious, if that would be controversial. I said, I don't think it would, but I do think that it's surprising to me how many people still have that story in their minds and know about it and had been exposed to it. So, yeah.
To show you the long tail of it, my aunt has as one of her prized possessions, and I'm not going to get it. I think one of my cousins is. She has one of the original menorahs, and she regards this as not just something historical, but something that's really meaningful, and we've talked about it often. So I think that there's a lot of people, and I've told my children what I lived through, and again, that's why I think it's really, I speak not on behalf of all the media, but as a member of it, that keeping this in the forefront, because I think there's a lot of frustration today about how do we help, how do we get involved, but not understanding the models. And this is but one, but a very important and powerful one. And let me tell you, without Margie and Chuck's, without the leadership, saying just the leadership and a number of the people that Janice highlighted, we couldn't, and without republishing books on these anniversaries, this is how we do it. And it takes everybody. But I also feel like I was 18, but it's pretty soon it's still our generation now to pass this on. I have a 14, 13, and 11-year-old.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time, but I do want to ask if any of you have anything final you want to say before we finish. Yes, Janice.
Yes, on the Gary Svee, who was an editor of the Billings Gazette, said something that has a quote that's literally on the cover of my book for the 30th anniversary edition. And he says, "Just a tiny candle we lit. It wasn't much, but it was something." And I just think how different our country would be if every town, if every city lit a tiny candle.
Well, I think that's an oh, sorry,
No, I think Janice has ended on a really good note. It's just one little thing that really, the idea that people really didn't think it was any big deal. I mean, they did, but they didn't. I mean, they struggled to do it, to make that decision, but they also just thought, well, this is what people should do. But then when the response that came back in the letters column of the Gazette and the letters that came for weeks afterwards were so profound, and people would write and say, you know, I grew up without any aunts or uncles, and if people had done this back in the time when this was just beginning in Europe, it might have gone differently for our family. And those things just brought tears to our eyes, and the community was, I think, kind of blown away by the affirmation and the incredible embrace and positive response that we got. We still are amazed, I think, that people are talking about it. So I'll just stop there.
Well, I think those are both really excellent notes to end on. And again, I want to thank all four of you for being here with us today, for sharing this story. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And I also want to recommend again, for everybody who wants more information, please visit thechristmasmenorahs.com. You can learn more there. And also, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.